So good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I'd also like to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share and our presenters. We'll not be recording any video input or audio from you. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Michael, and I am Project and Research Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these two countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to discuss how Chinese perceptions of Australia, the Australia-China relationship, and recent developments in this relationship translate. UTS ACRI Director, Professor James Lawrenson, will moderate an in-conversation style discussion with Jack Brady, Will Glasgow, and Diane Hu. Audience questions are welcome at the end. Now, a little bit about the speakers. Professor James Lawrenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. He also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship in such publications as the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and South China Morning Post, amongst many others. Jack Brady is the CEO and Executive Director of AustCham Shanghai. He leads a team of staff across 4 departments and drives AustCham's mission to strengthen Australia-China business, government, and community relationships. Mr. Brady is an Executive Director of the AustCham Shanghai Board of Directors. He was previously the General Manager of AustCham. Prior to joining AustCham Shanghai, he worked in Sydney with government relations and corporate communications firm GRA Causeway as a national research and policy manager. He holds a Bachelor of Arts with first-class honours from the University of Sydney. Will Glasgow is the Australian's China correspondent based in Beijing. In 2018, he won the Keith MacDonald Award for Business Journalist of the Year. He previously worked at the Australia Financial Review. Dr. Diane Hu is Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the Australian Studies Centre at Beijing Foreign Studies University and Deputy General Secretary of the Chinese Association for Australian Studies. She's the Deputy Chief Editor of Australia Blue Book, China's leading annual Blue Book on Australia, and sits on the editorial board of the International Australian Studies Association, Journal of Australian Studies. She's also Associate at the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Hu is on the Board of Experts for China's National People's Congress, advising on the English version of laws passed at the National Legislature. She's been an active commentator on China-Australia relations. I'd now like to welcome Professor James Lawrenson to introduce the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, it's my first time in the moderating hot seat today. If there's any mishaps today, I'm sure it will be as a result of my mishaps rather than our wonderful panelists that we've managed to assemble today. As Michael said, ACRI's mission is to inform Australia's engagement with China. Now, it's natural sitting here in Sydney to form perceptions about China, but of course engagement is a two-way street. And if the Australia-China relationship is to be, if all the opportunities are going to be exploited and all the risks from both countries' perspectives are to be managed effectively, we also now need to think about Australia relations, the perspective from China. That includes the perspective of Chinese citizens in China, obviously, but it also includes Australians with on-the-ground experience in China as well. And that's exactly the spectrum of the panel of experts we have today to discuss these issues. To the extent that we do hear about Chinese perspectives in Australia, it is very often the perspective of official outlets, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm sure Will Glasgow has spent quite a bit of time sitting in on their briefings. And people like me often find ourselves reading the pages of the Global Times, state media outlets as well. And they present a particular view of China's perspective on the Australia relationship. So today we're here to unpack these issues, not just from that official perspective, but from the perspective of Chinese citizens, Chinese businesses, and Australians on the ground in China. Diane, I might go to you first off. Before we get into any details, I wanted to ask you about how it is that official tensions in the relationship might spill over to unofficial ones. When we hear the Ministry of Foreign Affairs talking, when we hear the Chinese ambassador speaking in Canberra, I remember particularly an interview he gave with Andrew Tillett from the Australian Financial Review earlier this year, where he raised the possibility that Chinese consumers may not find Australian beef or Australian wine as good tasting as it did before. Chinese parents may not think of Australia as an attractive destination to send their children. So look, we can easily understand how the Chinese government might prevent the trade in goods through explicit ways, you know, a port closure, a tariff on Australian barley, for example. But another one we often hear is that the Chinese government could impact on Australia's engagement with China through unofficial channels, such as signalling in China's media. So I wanted to ask you, what are the ways that this engagement could be stopped, and how seriously do you weigh those risks, such as through official Chinese government messaging through the media?
Thank you, James. I think based on your questions, I think you're making two assumptions. And one assumption is definitely that people in China and in their opinions about other countries are always influenced by the media. And with that, and also one further assumption is that Chinese media listen to or are state controlled, or listen to what the country wants them to say, or what the government wants them to say. I'm not sure that I would go along with that on both assumptions, because they're really complicated ones, but I can share a little bit, as a Chinese, about news consumption in China, which I'm seeing a lot of misunderstanding right now, really. So the first thing I like to say, so like Australians, newspapers and television now are really still very important sources of news for the Chinese. I think it's pretty much the same everywhere, but increasingly so, we're seeing the social media. And in China, the situation through WeChat and everything, social media, many of the accounts are really opened by the print media or television. So pretty much you get the same sources of news. And again, I would like to stress that profound changes are undergoing in China, like everywhere in the world. So in China, again, you see the filter bubbles, you see the echo chambers, so all these things are the same. But I would like to, again, challenge something, an assumption that has been going on for quite a long time. And I like to challenge this upfront. He said a lot of people are describing this shift in sentiment as a recent one, but I'm going to argue that it's not. I'm afraid that the Chinese perception of Australia and the bilateral relations has always been divided or fragmented, you can even say that. So we used to run a account on Weibo, so which is like Twitter. So we would translate news about Australia's politics, society, culture, and everything, and present them to the Chinese audience. So we did a research on the reads, comments, and forwards of those people, and we found, interestingly, people's attention can be roughly put into three categories. One thing is that Australia, beautiful country, laid back, flora and fauna, and Gold Coast and everything, all of these things about the good, friendly Australia. And then you always see a lot of people pursuing questions about their visa. Interesting section. And that also share it. So I want to stress further upfront. I mean, it's not a recent shift. I mean, the Chinese in Australia has always been divided, has always been fragmented into those two.
Thanks, Diane. That lays the scene nicely. So I'm getting your screen freezing up a bit, Diane, so I hope you can hear me okay, but I'm going to plow ahead anyway on the assumption that you can hear me okay. You did a very recent in-depth poll of Chinese public opinion towards Australia. You're the Australian Study Centre at Beijing Foreign Studies University. And it was the first large-scale poll I think I can recall seeing taking that perspective. In Australia, of course, we're familiar with the annual Lowy poll each year, which includes some questions about China. Could you share for our audience today, I know it was a big poll, it covered a lot of ground, but could you share with our audience today a couple of the standout findings for you from that poll that you ran earlier this year?
Thank you, James, and sorry for the freeze on the screen. I'm in Melbourne, so we're in stage 4. So the worst situation for lockdown. So we launched our special poll on Australia and Chinese perception of bilateral relations in June. And I will have to admit, this is the first along the line, and we understand the beauty and the most important thing about it is to repeat it every year. And the idea really started from with my personal observations, starting from 2018. James, if you would remember, when in February 2018, when I did that podcast with you at ACRI, I was already talking about this shifting sentiment in China among the well-educated and the well-paid group against Australia. So basically, the poll is trying to quantify that. And I like to summarize the whole thing into one sentence about what we have found. Is that people-to-people connections between the countries have been strong. No one can deny that as a result of human mobility, but they are starting to shift and can be further eroded. So that's our basic finding of that. And how would that be relevant to Australia? I mean, I do economic studies, so for me, concern, Australia's trading services really concentrate in education and tourism, and both are really about personal experience and people's satisfaction with that experience. So for that, I think given the 2 to 3 years, in fact, we are already seeing in the international students numbers, we are seeing slower growth for higher education and also TAFE students, and also we're seeing fewer people in all other categories. I think it's already a sign that it's eroding. And I wouldn't disagree with those who argue that trade wouldn't suffer too much short term. I agree with everyone that because well, even for education and travel, because the market is huge, James. But I would argue that if the mutual respect and trust continues to decline like this, then people-to-people connections, which really have been built up over the past 40 to 50 years after diplomatization by millions of people, they would definitely suffer. And I think in the long run, that would have serious implications.
Thanks, Diane. When we think about people-to-people connections, we immediately leap for tourism and education. It goes beyond that, of course, as well. I just think of last week, we had a research report out from the Australia-China Relations Institute that documented more Australian scientific publications now have a Chinese co-author than an American one. So that's another example of strong people-to-people connections between the two countries at the researcher level. Will, I might go to you and your fine background next. Now, you haven't been sitting in Beijing running public opinion polls with 1,000 or more people like Diane has, but you have been getting out and about, meeting lots of regular Chinese people going about their business. I particularly remember a series of reports you wrote, I think it was back in May, on your visit to Qingdao. including the very impressive Mr. Zhang, a 71-year-old Chinese man who was very proud to stand in front of your cameras in Budgie Smugglers. And I've got to say, he had every right to be proud because
I was going to say, James,
he looked absolutely smashing. Yeah. So, Will, can I throw that question to you? You've been in Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, press briefings, but you've also done those visits and spoken to plenty of regular Chinese people on the street. What's your impression? Is there a disjoint between what we in Australia read on the Global Times and what you're finding on the ground?
A huge one. And look, I mean, I agree entirely with what Diane said, that there's a real caricature of Chinese public opinion in Australia, or how it's presented in Australia a lot, and even by how the Chinese officials, government officials, present Chinese opinion. So that's monolithic, and this sort of bizarre idea that, you know, the Global Times jots down an editorial and the hordes of 1.4 billion Chinese, like robots, do exactly what they're told. It's just complete rubbish. So that reporting I did out in Qingdao was following that interview Finn had with the Chinese ambassador in Canberra. And I was really interested by that idea. It's a phrase that the Chinese government officials use a lot, the feelings of the Chinese people, the feelings of the Chinese people being heard. And the claim was that because of Australia's advocacy, thought bubble line or whatever, of an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, Chinese people's feelings would be so hurt that they wouldn't buy wine, wouldn't buy beef and other things from Australia. And that clashed so much with everything I've experienced living in Beijing. Whenever I say I'm from Australia, either blank face or I talk about a koala, or quite often amongst urban Beijingers, people talk about their daughter who studies in Melbourne, or their cousin who's living in Sydney and moved 10 years ago and is really happy, or, you know, it's personal relationships, a personal connection. Someone went there on a holiday and had a terrific time, whatever. No one has ever said anything like, "Oh, you're a lapdog of America, and I and I read this morning in the Global Times that I'm not going to eat your beef anymore." No one's ever said anything like that. And actually, Australian beef's proudly on menus throughout Beijing. Jack would probably tell you the same thing in Shanghai. I mean, most good steak places, burger places will proudly have on the menu 100% Australian beef. And they're not embarrassed of it. They're not worried that people are going to find out they're smuggling in politically incorrect protein. They're emblazing it on the menu. So I went out to Qingdao because Qingdao beer uses Australian malt, Australian and Canadian malt, right? And that was one of the things that got whacked with big tariff, but perhaps by coincidence, went into effect during this tussle over the independent inquiry. But actually, the process started a year ago, so maybe it was a coincidence, but it was a useful one, perhaps. But anyway, wanted to find out, what do people think about, you know, is it just that in the Beijing bubble, people are being polite to me or something about Australia?
Is that like the Canberra bubble, Will?
I like the Canberra bubble, right?
Right, sure.
So we went out to Qingdao for that reason. And it was so easy to find people who were saying lovely things about Australia. And I tried. The thing I should stress, I mean, I'm a journalist, right? I've got no, like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? It would be great for me, for a page one story, if I could find people in Qingdao saying, ever since the Morrison government did this, I refuse to buy this, you know, Australian products, or I'm so offended by, you know, Australia's action that I'm boycotting travel to Australia or whatever. I just couldn't find that. I found people who had, as they told me, who thought Australia was a friendly country or a nice place. And like the terrific swimmer, he has a cousin there, so they've got person-to-person connections. And like Diane said, that's such a profound thing, that you've got 1.2 million people with Chinese heritage in Australia. So, you know, the biggest source of tourists to Australia are Chinese. Since I've been back in Sydney, I've come back for some family reasons. Hopefully I'll be back very soon to Beijing. But I'm just struck by how much Mandarin I overhear when I'm getting around Sydney, and how many East Asian and Chinese faces I see here. It's this story of Australia is so different to as it's portrayed in the Global Times, which is not news to Diane, and it's not, or to me, or to people in China, or to most people in China even. They think if you say, oh, I read in the paper that that the Chinese people's feelings have been hurt by whatever, and you ask them about that, they just look at you puzzled, like, what are you talking? Who do you think I am? What do you think I'm going to do?
Okay, thanks for that perspective, Will. Let's not slag off the Global Times too much.
No,
I've just got to jump in here that they published one of my commentary pieces just this morning, which incidentally was arguing that Australia is not a US lapdog. So there you go. Even in the Global Times, there's room for a little bit, at least, of diversity. Will, you gave us the perspective there of the average Chinese people you've been speaking to. I did want to home in, if you didn't mind, on a question that I thought some Australians might or might not be talking about in China at the moment. You'd be familiar with, just last month, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra upgraded its travel advisory for Australians in China and warned them of the risk of arbitrary detention. I wanted to, have you been having an increasing number of conversations with friends and colleagues, Australian friends and colleagues in China about that risk? And if so, what are they saying?
Yeah, I have, with people in China and Australians in China. I mean, Jack will talk to this too. Maybe he's got a different opinion or be interested if it's the same. But the consensus for most of us is that nothing's changed in how in our risk assessment. That there are certainly some risks to people in China, and you've got to be careful about certain behaviour. But certainly, as a journalist going around doing my job, I have to be aware of certain things. But nothing's changed for me this side of the travel advice. But I think the situation's different depending on your profile. If you're as I understand it, that warnings come in because of a harmonisation with the change of advice for Hong Kong. Clearly, facts on the ground have changed with the new national security legislation there. If you've behaved in a certain way, you have a certain profile, that new law would be an exciting thing to test in Hong Kong. And this is very much the test case. They're looking for some examples to prove, but where it applies and where it doesn't. So as I understand it, that change in Hong Kong, which you can clearly see the reasons, the facts that have led to that change. I think that's, as I understand it, led to a harmonisation with the advice for mainland China, which I think would have come from a bit of a back and forth, maybe in DFAT. Well, we're going to have this warning for Hong Kong because of the harmonisation with mainland China's laws. Why don't we have it for mainland China? But for me personally, I don't feel that, I can't wait to get back.
Right, okay.
I'm not so worried about being in a dark prison or something.
Right.
But so I must say, it certainly had a big impact in Australia. So that's the consensus of people I know in China who have asked, am I missing something here on this? But now in Australia, when I've come back, because my dad's just had heart surgery and I was picking up my wife. We came back in January. We'll go back together as soon as our visa comes through. Back in Australia, though, a lot of my friends and some family thought I've come back because I sort of fled. And I mean, people, there is definitely, I've picked up a lot of anxiety back in Australia about that. And I have to basically have the conversation we just had there.
Well, so that's exactly why we're having this webinar today, right? So we can get those different perspectives from the folks in Australia and those based on the ground in China as well. Jack, you also have a stellar background accompanying you today, which I understand is from South Australia.
The Unforeseen Sinkhole in South Australia. It's our new building here, so small bit of product placement.
I'm a proud Queenslander. I should have had a picture of Brisbane or the Gold Coast behind me. Jack, you're on the ground and you have been on the ground for many years now. Right now, you're the CEO of Auscham in Shanghai. So your members are Australian companies trying to go about their business, selling their goods and services in the mainland Chinese market to Chinese consumers and to Chinese businesses as well. Now, obviously, the business environment in China, just as it is in Sydney, is tough right now because of COVID-19. But there's this additional complication that sometimes political tensions can spill over to have economic impacts, and it might not just be Australian barley being shipped to China, being whacked with tariffs. It could be Australian businesses on the ground facing other regulatory challenges, perhaps, that inhibit their ability to do business. So I was wondering if you could give our audience an update on what your experience has been on the ground in those areas in Shanghai in the most recent months.
Sure, thanks, James. Maybe just to go off Will's comment, when we get a steak at the bun that has a flag saying politically incorrect protein, we've got a big challenge for the... It's definitely not the case at the moment. But look, it's been an interesting year. It's been challenging. Yeah, I haven't left China, obviously, since returning from my Christmas holidays in Australia back in January. So I think, you know, your question is really, has the political tension or has a sort of down wave in the relationship impacted trade? It's a difficult answer because COVID has muddied the waters, right? I mean, back in January, this was a really a China challenge. The country was closed, it was shut down. Obviously, China responded in an incredible fashion. Shanghai did a great job making sure we didn't have too much local transmission. And since then, our members, like all businesses, Chinese and foreign, have, you know, gone through that process of downsizing, cost cutting, restarting, working from home or reopening the office, obviously impacted by trade challenges, you know, mostly around travel and logistics and export. But the question is, you know, at the same time, the relationship's gone through a bit of an interesting period. We've polled our members twice this year to understand how they've been faring. First in February, very much just around what was the impact on the virus, and then more recently in July. What we do know is that 83% of our members are not, they have a negative outlook for the Australia-China relationship. But what I would say is, in my time in Shanghai the last 5 years, we've seen, you know, ebbs and flows in the relationship come about. This time round, with the exception of beef and barley, I do find it hard to point to any concrete anecdotes where that political tension has, you know, moved on to a trade challenge. You know, the question obviously for exporters and people here in China is, well, what would that look like if it were to happen? The conversation at this side is, I think, the same debate that we're having back in Australia. So for Australian exporters, for people in the US, people in Europe, it is really around a question mark of exposure to international trade or one market, maybe China. But it's also the same for Chinese importers, buyers and distributors. If they're really heavily weighted to Australian products and they're reading the same media that we all do and realize that there's a lot of tension or there's a lot of scuttlebutt way above our pay grades and security clearances, then of course they talk to Australian exporters and say, well, look, you know, how sure are your supply chains? What will we do if we have a situation with clearing products? So yeah, in short answer to your question, James, members are concerned. Australian businesses are bouncing back from the COVID impact. But yeah, by and large, beyond beef and barley, fingers crossed, things are going okay and business is getting on with business.
Right. Jack, can I follow up? This is a bit of an unfair question for you in a sense, because I know you're the CEO of AusCham, so your interests are focused around Australian businesses in China. But I'm guessing that you probably maintain a good relationship with other chambers of commerce in Shanghai, perhaps the American one, the Canadian one, the UK, New Zealand perhaps. Those bilateral relationships with China, all those countries are having their own set of tensions. What are your counterparts in those chambers saying? Are they reporting any stories or anecdotes of their country's official tensions with China also spilling over to the business frame?
Yeah, good question. Look, we're Aussie first and foremost, but there's plenty of gossip and scuttle. International community inside the inner ring road in Shanghai, probably the same in Beijing. Look, I'd probably make a couple of points. One is, I think, you know, globally there's just a new order of political tension, and that, you know, really can be said with and without China. You know, just this morning I was looking up, you know, this year isn't unique for Australia or for other international communities engaging with China. The US-China trade relationship has been going through its spat or trade war, whatever you want to call it, for something like 880 days, you know, since March 2018, you know, when President Trump leveled new tariffs on steel and aluminium. Obviously, the Canadians have had some challenges. We know that other European economies have, surfed different scenarios across the years. So, of course, that sort of question mark of political tension has been ever thus with international trade and obviously China specifically. I don't think this year there's been an increase so much on the chatter among the international community about, what's happening. What I would say is that the market opportunity here isn't going away, right? So while the US has been challenged with China for probably 3 years, they say that Starbucks on average is opening a new store in China every 15 hours. People are still investing. That's still what is in front of us. The question for individual exporters or businesses is how happy and how comfortable are they entering a global marketplace, China specifically, managing their risk. I think what I would say is that everybody knows now that it's never been a better time to make sure that your house is in order. And that is, your labeling, your customs clearance process, your adherence to regulation. You need to be watertight. You can't have a China strategy based on, weak enforcement. I think that is now being well understood from a sort of governance and risk management perspective for exporters internationally.
Thanks, Jack. Diane, I might just shoot back to you with another question. You're obviously at BFSU. Jack's on the ground in Shanghai. Will's usually, when he's not in Qingdao speaking to Mr. Zhang, he's in Beijing as well. But your poll was done in, if I remember correctly, in 10 major cities throughout China. Do you get any sense that Chinese households or businesses further away from Beijing may be less affected by the political tensions than those more connected to the political scene in Beijing or the commercial capital of Shanghai?
Thank you, James, for bringing that up, because I think that's really something we need to be very clear about when we start to look at the results and do analysis of our polling, because we use the panel, so pretty much like the Lowy poll. But the thing about it, and that's really, it's not a real limitation, but it's really something that I need to clarify at the very beginning, is that we find that the respondents are from 10 major Chinese cities. So they are the biggest Chinese cities right now. In other words, it's a very urban population, and also more than 70% of them belong to the higher income and higher education group. So this is why we did a little bit, though, we are trying to adjust it to represent the national population, the makeup of the national population, because very early results of the cross-tabulation is trying to say that if we adjust it to represent the national population, the thermometer and a lot of responses to the question will appear much, much less favorably than we see now. So that's why we're trying to do that. So this is something that is really important, is that the cross-tabulation already shows that people who are, say, not in Beijing and Shanghai, the cities which you get to see the most about Australia, they tend to think less favorably of Australia. I think that's pretty much a rule. And what we're trying to find out is the degree. But there are other very interesting findings too, in that I was talking to some of the Australian diplomats in Beijing the other day about Shanghai, and Jack has been in Shanghai for 5 years. He said, we were really surprised to find that Shanghai just recorded the lowest feeling thermometer among the biggest cities, like Beijing, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. And we were really surprised by that, because we would think that with so much presence of Australian businesses and all these events and things in Shanghai, the Shanghai people would appear to have, the greatest thermometer. They would be the greatest fan. But the funny part about it is that we got to know that an earlier survey, a rather smaller one, but the Australian Embassy also shows the same result. So we think that's something that we're going to dig deeper.
Diane, is that linked at all to the AFL launching in Shanghai?
Linked to what? Sorry.
Does that correlation of declining favourability of Australia and Shanghai, does that sync about the same time with the AFL starting playing games in Shanghai?
Oh, well, that's a
something to study. I'm not saying it's definite, but it's a hunch.
I think it means you should take more AFL lessons to show.
or less, Diane. So I think Will's demonstrated why he's a very wonderful journalist. He may struggle on the academic front, though, Will, with hypotheses, like that one. Diane, I'm going to break to the audience Q&A now, and I see one that I thought I would put to you, Diane, first, and then I've got one for Jack and Will to comment on. It's an interesting question. So it says, it starts with an observation that people-to-people ties between Australia and China are solid. So Diane, you know that Will, Jack, and people like me and all your Australian friends, you know how we feel about China. And the question is, are there opportunities for this attitude set? So for these attitudes held within these people-to-people ties, is there an opportunity for that to inform the political establishment in Beijing, right? So do you see the question? So someone like you who knows Australia well, you've got plenty of Australian friends, are there opportunities for you to feed into the political deliberative processes in Beijing about Australia relations?
Thank you, James. I think it's definitely a common expectation that such people-to-people exchange will promote understanding, trust on both sides, and hopefully that will go up to the government level to influence the decision-making. And I think that's what many people are really trying to do. But I really think there's always a possibility for that. But I think something that is really missing in our discussion is that there's also the other side of it. The other side of it is that, when you look at the history of China, how it has dealt with its relations with other countries, you find that we don't really go along with a westernized way of, foreign relations. And you find that in many ways, it's really, things are really done on a personal relationship level. It's pretty much like that. And that's why the ambassador and a lot of people are also talking about people getting hurt. And I can tell you, James, that even as an Australian studies scholar, I get hurt sometimes. When I saw
hopefully not by me.
The government said things. So I think that's an underlying part of that. It's just that we see the people-to-people connection, but the Chinese mentality would be, because we have this connection, I would expect you to be more friendly to me. I think that's something that has not been discussed too much. And I think that is at play as well.
Mm.
James, can I jump in on that? Is that okay?
Either Will or Jack, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just make the comment. I think this is the multi-billion-dollar question for Australia is obviously influence and access in the hearts and minds of both people in China, but also those that decide the direction of the country. And that's not a challenge that's specific to Australia. Obviously, Beijing has a very opaque political system, but when they move, very clearly in terms of expressing which way the country will go. And that is really the situation, now with obviously bouncing back out of COVID. So Australia's challenge is really around understanding how that system works and how we can, I suppose, embed people and make sure we have more Australians, coming to China and basing themselves in Beijing and building up those networks across the years.
Mm. Will, did you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, it would be great. The problem is that there's such huge structural challenges there, like getting to China. It's really hard. Our paper, before I was posted at the start of this year, I was going to be doing, along with some other journalists, we had one. We could talk about this because it didn't happen. We got a grant from the Judith Neilson Centre of Journalism. We want to do a project reporting on China through Chinese, talking to people, just regular citizens, to do exactly what you were saying before, get away from the government spokespeople, get away from the state-owned media, and actually talk to Chinese people about, and not to shackle it in the bilateral relationship, but really to report on China today as it is, as people just look at, urban Chinese compared to rural Chinese, Shanghai compared to Beijing. It was a beautiful project. I was so excited about it. And then it couldn't happen because we weren't allowed to get visas to go in there because reporting in China is such a fraught thing. For non-Chinese journalists. I mean, the Chinese system is just set up in opposition to it. It's very threatened by it. And unless you go in with a host organization, sit in on every single interview you do and has a list of all the stories you're going to write and reviews them before publication, all things that are just completely impossible for the Australian or for a similar kind of media outlet to agree to. You can't do the project. It's such a shame because that's a structural problem that gets in the way of us better telling that story. And I don't see any way to fix that, but it has consequences and they're bad. So it's a shame, but.
It's a shame for both countries, isn't it?
Oh, completely. And it's the same, like, you know, the China Matters rejection of Andrew Hastie and James Patterson. That's another real shame. Where I wish more Australian parliamentarians went to China. Far more go to Taiwan than they go to China. Maybe that's going to China, depends who you talk to. But you know, there's not enough visits by politicians. But again, there are structural reasons for that. It's a lot harder for those trips to happen. And then the whole security who are around going, it's really difficult. So yeah, room for improvement, but I mean, I don't know how that happens.
Thanks, Will. Look, our next question is one for any one of you three, or all three of you, to have a stab at. The observation comes from some data that was in this morning's newspapers. Will, you'll be happy to hear that I read it in the Australian first. But it's a stunning statistic, absolutely stunning. And that is that the most recent trade data shows that 48% of Australia's goods exports are going to China. As someone, I've been criticised in the past for talking up the Australia-China economic relationship, but even I could never have imagined that that proportion would get so high. So the question is, there's an observation that people-to-people connections remain strong. So that's one reason why those trade flows also remain firmly in place. But what else does the panel attribute these trade figures to? I know the total value of Australia, not just as a proportion, the total value of Australia's exports to China, even during COVID-19, a massive negative economic shock, the overall dollar values have held up pretty well. Now, I know there's an iron ore story there and all that sort of stuff, but what do you folks attribute the resilience in the trade relationship to? Why don't you kick us off, Will?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's funny. You've called this, I think, an economic zombie, this idea about that Australia is sort of unhelpfully or dangerously economically exposed to China. And just month after month or quarter after quarter when the trade numbers come out, it is incredible. For 3 years during poisonous high-level bilateral political relations, the economic relationship between the two countries is just extraordinary. And keep setting records. That's happening through COVID, and the tensions that have come from that are just amazing. But it shows that point that, you know, business goes on. The Australian product in China, I mean, Australian suppliers have been terrific. So that iron ore's come in. There's a lot of focus on the Chinese stimulus there, sure. But also Australia's suppliers have been able to produce it. That's not the case with the rival supplier, Brazil. It's been a disaster. So we've been very reliable. We've been able to get the product to market. One of the numbers, there's a lot of focus on the iron ore one. I was amazed to see wine sales to China in the last 12 months down 1%. It's extraordinary when I think of the slowdown across. I mean, the Chinese economy's been very impressive in how it's got back to work during this, but it's hugely unequal what bits have got back and what haven't. And, you know, the steel mills kept going throughout, and that's expressed in the iron ore sales. But restaurants, I'm sure Jack would say the same in Shanghai. Everywhere I've traveled in China, in Qingdao and Shenzhen, throughout Fujian, in Beijing, there's nothing near the kind of numbers of people in restaurants compared to before coronavirus. But that wine sales from Australia held up is really fascinating, and that's the Australian wine story is just incredible. I mean, what an example of excellent marketing by Australia and a product that's really loved there. We've overtaken France as the biggest export, overtaken France, unbelievable, by value to China. And we're going up the value chain. So we're exporting less of the cheap stuff and more of the $20 to $30 bottle to China. So we're selling to the middle class of China. That's great. And we haven't been hit as much like the French by the corruption crackdown, because they were selling a lot of prestigious fancy labels from certain chateaux. You can't do that anymore if your big buyer was corrupt government officials who have now been locked up, you know. So we've benefited from the crackdown, the corruption crackdown as well. And it also means that our consumer there isn't a state buyer, which is much more resilient. And it means that we're less, like Diane, that was a really interesting observation. It totally chimes with my experience that amongst the most educated, wealthy China, that's where you find the most positive experiences with Australia, largely because they're the people who visit Australia as tourists, and they're the ones whose family members come and study there. Now, they're also the ones who drink Australian wine and who go to coffee shops that sell things called Melbourne latte or Melbourne style latte, or have roasted coffee with silhouettes of inner Sydney on the coffee pack, because there's that attachment amongst that group of people to Australia.
Jack or Diane, did you have any quick observations on that? Just some quick ones around the resilience of that trade despite the official tensions.
Yeah, just make a couple of quick comments, James. Well, I suppose I've only seen the headline this morning, so I don't know if there's any detail about what is in the percentage, but it's a huge number, right? Basically, half of our exports come into one market. The questions I would have is, you know, obviously it shows complementarity. There's a reason why Chinese buyers are interested in Australian exports, so that's taken as a given, and we'll mention some of those reasons. What I'd ask is, how much is iron ore? I think China's going to build out of this slowdown, and they've made, you know, already a huge amount of effort to do that. Is there a lag on education numbers or tourism numbers? They're typically billed as exports. So what's interesting is the data initially is showing that students who are already enrolled aren't necessarily cancelling in vast numbers. I think there's up to 40,000 current higher education students who are in China, and they're doing things like this, engaging with their studies remotely. But there's initial data to show that potentially the applications are dipping by about 30%. So the main question I would have is this an outlier number, or is the trend going to continue? And the third point I'd make is, does that mean the rest of the world is in a basket case? And this is the only market that's going to grow off the backside of COVID. So maybe that's got something to do with it as well.
They're just goods, not services, those numbers.
They're just goods, okay.
Just goods, yeah.
Diane, what about you? Do you have just any other quick, I've got a few other questions I'm keen to get to, but I would like to hear any observations you had.
Right. Thank you. I think trade numbers are really tricky, and especially when you look at this one. Iron ore is there, and also you have to look at the price, and also some contracts are really made a long time ago. So trade numbers are always complicated. I think the trade numbers are telling two things. One is that the market is too large. It's huge. I mean, there are always opportunities there. I think it's telling that story. And the second one is that I think it shows how much work that individual Chinese and Australians, back to our people-to-people connection story, are trying so hard to continue to do what they need to do, but whose voices are not heard in the media, or who choose not to be heard in the media.
Right. Thanks, Diane. That's a sharp observation. Look, I've got 3 questions here that I want to get through really quickly. So I'm just let's limit our answers to say 10 seconds. I think, here's the first one. There's been talks of physical attacks against Asians in Australia this year. The question is, is the reverse also true? Has there been any talk about foreigners being attacked on the streets of Shanghai or Beijing? Just a quick response. Jack, you had any trouble?
No trouble. Haven't seen it, haven't heard it.
Will, Diane?
There was a foreigner backlash in it's a strange evolution in coronavirus in China. Maybe by about March or April, as cases started polluting outside of China. Suddenly, to be a foreigner, when I first started traveling outside of Beijing, when I was allowed to, I had a few strange experiences where people would jump away from me when they saw me because there were no other foreigners in these cities in Fujian.
That wasn't about
One
COVID.
just jumped saying "foreigner, foreigner" because and I said, "What was that about?" And it turned out he just heard that day that the cases there were all called imported cases from foreigners. That nationals returning home, but the way people were understanding it in China was that not everyone, but there was a big group of people understanding that if you saw someone who looked foreign, they were likely carrying coronavirus.
Diane, you haven't heard
Yeah.
No, okay. Next question. Jack, this one's specifically for you, and I think you'll be able to give me a yes or a no answer. Are Australian businesses facing any political pressure on the ground in China right now? Or perhaps we should say any more so than you have previously.
Political pressure.
Political pressure.
No, I mean, questions and observations, but I wouldn't say any political pressure.
Okay, thanks, Jack. And Diane, this is the last question I'll go to for you, and then I want some final observations from all three of you. The question is, do you think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with their lack of cut through to Western publications and audiences, so Australians who know Chinese people have a different perception of China than to say an Australian who doesn't have any Chinese friends and only picks up the messaging from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. Is that of any concern to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that lack of public diplomacy cut through, or do you think they simply don't care? It's a big question, Diane. I'm sorry to give you that big one, but if you could give a brief answer, that'd be great.
I wish I could answer that. I'm not in any way affiliated to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Sure.
So really difficult for me to know about that. Yeah, I think that's a really...
Sure. Yeah, fair enough. We can't expect you to answer questions on behalf of the Chinese government when you work at BFSU. Okay, look, I think we'll turn now to the final question that I have for each of you today. And it's this one. You've all three of you have had experience on the ground in China. And the reality is that's pretty rare compared with Australia's population as a whole. What is the one thing you think Australians frequently get wrong or don't fully appreciate about China or Australia's relationship with China, based on your own experience? Diane, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm trying to think of a way to think of something to say, but not upsetting any Australian. I see funny panelists here. So I like to say that all countries would benefit from evidence-based news debate. This is the same for every country. But I would like to point out one recent trend that starts to worry me is what Professor David Walker describes as the instrumentalism, or early on I would describe it as the practicality when Australia looks to China, especially when you compare the recent look with the past generation for sinologists or Chinese studies scholars. He said at that time they were still curious about the country itself, the society and culture. And what I would say is that the all-rounded China literacy is so crucial for policymaking in any country. But like what you're seeing now is that I would say that most of the best Chinese-speaking and Chinese literate Australians are actually in China, not Australia, like Jack, like Will. So this actually would be applicable to China as well. And I think Australian literacy is crucial for China's decision-making or on its Australia policy as well. That's why the whole Australian studies community have tried really, really hard to show a multifaceted Australia. That would be all from me.
And good job too, Diane. the Australian study centres in China really do a fabulous job of increasing that literacy. So well done. Will, what's your one observation?
Yeah, for what people in Australia don't understand about China.
Yeah, or don't fully appreciate or have got wrong.
I think the big one is just remembering that in China, people spend very little time thinking about Australia. I mean, I know we've just spent this whole hour talking about that, and I do a lot of reporting when I ask people their opinions on that. But until they met me that day, I don't think they were thinking about Australia, unless they've got some personal connection. And people in Australia, understandably, China looms huge. The relationship with China and the relationship with the US are the two biggest for Australia. The relationship with Indonesia is very important as well. But in the Australian mind, China is very, very large. It's the biggest trading partner. It's just everywhere in people's life. There's so many Australian Chinese. In China, I think if people spent more time there, you would realize China's an enormous country. It spends a lot of time thinking about itself, an enormous, diverse country. It's in an extraordinary strategic neighborhood. They have got so many things to think about. And I think when sometimes the relationship seems so terrible, the bilateral one, I'd advise people read the transcript of the daily foreign ministry press conference. Have a look there. See how often does Australia actually come up? This morning the Indians got told off twice, French got told off once, the European Union got told off once, the Americans, as usual, got told off half the press conference, 4 or 5 questions. There was praise for Russia. That's a pretty static one, not a mention of Australia. That's what it's normally like. So we are not in some unique thing. We actually, the trade numbers, most countries would give anything for those numbers. God, Donald Trump's gone through a trade war for 2.5 years. They've got nothing like it. So, we can exaggerate our importance and I think overemphasize things.
Thanks, Will. Jack, a final very quick observation from you. Your one thing that you think Australians often get it wrong about China.
Very quickly, I'd probably just say that despite the large numbers, so 50% of exports, $200+ billion relationship, plenty of Chinese, Australians, it's not really well understood beyond the numbers. That still surprises me. I still feel that China literacy has got a long way to play. I agree with what Will said in terms of we're not a big fish in this part of the world, but the relationship is vast and it impacts so many people, but I still think we've got a long way to go. So not a groundbreaking observation, but obviously something that, ACRI and other organisations try to push forward.
We will do our best, Jack. Okay, Diane, Jack, and Will, thank you so much for joining us today to have this discussion. It's crucial that engagement is a two-way street, so these perceptions need to be shared in that bilateral direction. Just to wrap us up today, I'm going to flick back to my colleague, Michael Joel.
Thank you, James, Jack, Will, and Diane. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. The discussion today is also available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, James Lawrenson, Jack Brady, Will Glasgow, and Diane Hall. And thank you to all of our attendees. See you next time.